Step aside, Lexi. This picture is for people who are willing to bleed for their country, not for cowards who quit. The rough, heavy hand of Frank Woods slammed right into my chest. A decisive shove sent me stumbling backward right in front of the dark bronze warrior statue. He pointed a calloused finger at the 30-pound camera bag he had just tossed onto the ground. Pick the camera up and take a good shot. That is the only reason I let you drag your face to your brother's SEAL graduation. I stood dead silent. The Pacific Ocean waves crashing against the cliffs behind me were not as loud as the shattering inside my chest at that moment. By an active-duty Rear Admiral of the United States Navy, the person who signed the deployment orders for 3 strike fleets just last night was just shoved out of a family photo by my own biological father like a stray dog. But before I tell you why, that night was the single night in 30 years he would regret being blind to my power and who ended up paying the price. Hit like, subscribe to the channel, and do not go anywhere. Because what happens next, nobody in that room saw coming. The cab of Frank's rusting Ford F-15 smelled like a cheap motel room, stale tobacco, old fast food grease, and the bitter sweat of a man angry at the world. The suspension groaned and the tires whined against the hot California asphalt as we rolled slowly toward the heavily fortified main gate of Naval Base Coronado. Ahead, armed sentries in crisp uniforms checked incoming vehicles. I was behind the wheel. Frank always refused to drive on military installations. He wanted to sit in the passenger seat to be chauffeured around to feel like the important man he never became. Muscle memory took over. We were 50 yards from the checkpoint. My right hand moved smoothly toward the inside breast pocket of my dark civilian blazer. My fingers brushed the hard plastic of my Department of Defense identification card, the security hologram. The rank, Rear Admiral. 2 stars that commanded thousands of lives and controlled billions in Pacific Fleet assets. I pulled it out for the military police, a sudden blur of violent motion. Frank lunged across the wide center console. His heavy, calloused fingers dug brutally into the back of my hand. His fingernails caked with black engine grime scraped my skin hard enough to leave angry red welts. He snatched the security card from my grip with a jerk, his breath hot and foul, and hurled the plastic down onto the floorboard. "Put that damn desk jockey card away!" He spat, his voice a gravelly snarl that sprayed spit onto the dusty dashboard. My hands shot back to the steering wheel. I gripped the sun-cracked leather so hard the blood fled from my knuckles, leaving them bone-white. The violent spike of adrenaline hit the back of my throat like swallowed battery acid. The urge to react, to assert my command right there in the cramped cab of his rotting truck, was a crushing physical pressure inside my skull. I did not open my mouth. I did not yell. I clamped my jaw shut until my teeth ground together. Inhale for 4 seconds. The suffocated tobacco-stained air filled my lungs. Hold for 4 seconds. The military sentry up ahead raised a gloved hand, signaling us to slow to a crawl. Exhale for 4 seconds. Pushing out the blinding rage. Hold for 4 seconds. Tactical box breathing. It was the exact same rhythm I used in the blood-soaked heat of a bunker in Kandahar when mortar shells rained down, dropping dirt into open wounds. The breathing forced my heart rate down from a thumping sprint to a cold, calculated crawl. I turned my head just a fraction of an inch. My eyes, devoid of any warmth, slid over Frank's flushed face. He smirked, mistaking my silence for submission. He had no idea it was a trap setting its steel jaws. Frank settled back into his seat, crossing his hairy arms over his chest. He looked out the windshield at the base gate, then glared at me from the corner of his eye. His jaw worked heavily before he issued his mandate. "If anyone asks," he hissed, pointing a stubby finger right at my face, "you're just a coffee-fetching brat who pushes papers in some air-conditioned basement. You're a secretary. You staple garbage. Got it? I'm not going to let you ruin this day for your brother. I don't want these real men knowing the Woods family has a quitter." A quitter? The word hung in the hot air between us, toxic and heavy. He actually believed it. In his twisted reality, a washed-up E5 sergeant who never amounted to anything needed someone beneath him to feel 10 feet tall. My 2 stars were a lethal threat to his shattered ego, so he simply erased them. He demanded I play the failure, the ultimate disappointment. I did not nod. I did not voice an agreement. But I accepted the terms of engagement. The lie was laid out thick and impenetrable. It was the perfect cover. A phantom operating in plain sight. I looked down at my feet. My security clearance card, the encrypted plastic that could authorize carrier strike groups and access the Pentagon's deepest secure facilities, lay face down on the ribbed rubber floor mat. Frank shifted his weight. He deliberately lifted his heavy Timberland work boot, the thick sole caked with dried mud and motor oil, and planted it squarely on top of my card. He ground his heel down, pressing my entire identity into the dirt. We inched closer to the guard shack. The truck idled, vibrating my teeth. I leaned down. I did not ask him to move his foot. I shoved my bare fingers under the thick rubber sole of his boot. I dug my fingernails into the rigid edge of the card and violently pried it out from the caked mud. I held it up. The face of the card was smeared with greasy black dirt. I did not wipe it clean. I did not try to salvage its dignity. I shoved the filthy card deep into the front pocket of my slacks, letting the dirty plastic edge press hard against my thigh. A constant physical reminder. I hit the button to roll down the window. The salty Pacific wind rushed in, killing the stench of the truck. The sentry stepped up, his rifle slung across his chest. I did not look at Frank. I stared straight ahead with dead empty eyes and handed the guard my standard civilian driver's license. The tires of the F-150 hummed as we rolled past the heavy concertina wire of the main gate. The blinding California sun bounced off the gray steel hull of a guided missile destroyer docked in the bay, the glare slicing right through the bug-splattered windshield. Frank slapped the cheap frayed fabric of the passenger seat. Hard. A cloud of ancient dust and cigarette ash danced in the stale air. "Today is about real blood and guts," he announced to the dashboard. He was already working himself up, puffing his chest under a tight faded polo shirt that strained over his gut. Teddy Roosevelt said it best. It is not the critic who counts. It is the man in the arena. The man whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. He turned his thick, sunburned neck, shooting a sneer in my direction. His jaw jutted out, aggressive and ugly. Caleb is the man in the arena, a real operator, not a coward hiding behind a keyboard. He scoffed, a wet rattling sound in the back of his throat. You sit in air conditioning all day pushing papers, leeching off the system. Makes me sick to my stomach. Caleb actually puts his life on the line. He does the heavy lifting while you just quit. My jaw locked tight. The dirty plastic ID card in my pocket pressed a hard, sharp line into my thigh. I looked up. The rearview mirror caught the reflection of the back seat. My mother, Mary. She was pressed against the door panel, trying to make her frail frame as small as physically possible. Her trembling, wrinkled fingers dug into her worn leather purse, pulling out a tangled string of wooden rosary beads. Click, click, click. The hollow sound of the beads hitting each other, the rhythm of a coward. "Frank, please, don't start," she murmured. Her voice was thin, brittle. It was an obligation, not a defense. A line she had rehearsed for 30 years. She immediately squeezed her eyes shut, bowing her head and checking out completely. No intervention, no standing up for the daughter driving the truck. Just a pathetic whine before surrendering the floor to the tyrant. Her silence hit me harder than Frank's loud, stupid mouth, a punch you can brace for. But the silence of the person supposed to protect you. That is a cold knife twisting slow in the gut. An enabler's ultimate weapon is looking the other way. Dust and sweat and blood. I kept my eyes fixed on the black asphalt, but my mind snapped back to a windowless SCIF deep inside the Pentagon. The secure compartmented information facility, freezing recycled air, the relentless low hum of encrypted servers, the glow of tactical screens mapping out hostile territories. That was my arena. Just 72 hours ago, I stood in that sterile room staring at a satellite feed and authorized a kinetic strike that neutralized a terror cell creeping toward a Marine outpost in Al Anbar. I maneuvered 3 covert extraction teams to pull out an ambushed SEAL squad. Caleb's squad. I covered my Golden Boy brother's blind spot from 6,000 miles away. I moved billion-dollar naval assets to make sure he did not come home to Frank in a zinc-lined, flag-draped box. But Frank did not know that. Frank evaluated military glory by the grease on a man's hands. He did not know about the thick, knotted scar tissue wrapping around my left shoulder. An AK-47 round shattered my collarbone in Kandahar while I was dragging a bleeding field medic behind a concrete barrier. I swallowed the agony, packed the wound with gauze, and kept firing. I bled for this country. I bled for this family. But to the washed-up E5 sitting next to me, high on his own delusions of grandeur, I was just a useless secretary fetching coffee. The clicking of Mary's rosary beads sped up in the back. Click, click, click. It was the sound of a family rotting from the inside out. I killed the last remaining ember of hope in my chest. The pathetic, lingering hope that maybe just once my parents would look at me and actually see me. That craving for validation died right there in the driver's seat, suffocated by the smell of stale tobacco and sheer hypocrisy. I did not need them to understand. The isolation was no longer a punishment. I strapped it on. I wore it like heavy Kevlar. If you have ever sat in a room with your own family and realized you were completely alone, you know this exact kind of silence. If you have ever watched a parent enable your abuser instead of protecting you, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment the word alone down below. We need to remind each other that stepping away from toxic bloodlines does not make you a traitor. It makes you a survivor. I pressed the heavy sole of my shoe hard against the gas pedal. The old V8 engine roared a mechanical scream that drowned out Frank's rambling and Mary's empty prayers. I whipped the heavy truck into the sun-baked VIP parking lot of the Naval Amphibious Base. The tires shrieked in violent protest before I slammed my foot on the brake. The F-150 jerked to a brutal halt, throwing us forward against the seatbelts. I cut the ignition. The engine choked, sputtered, and died. The silence that followed was heavy and thick. "Get out!" Frank barked, already kicking his rusted door open. The blistering California heat rushed into the cab like an oven blast, carrying the smell of salt and hot tar. He did not even look back at me. And do not drop the ice cooler. Caleb's hands are for holding a rifle, not dragging luggage. You are carrying everything. The heat radiating off the black asphalt hit me like a physical blow. 100 degrees of stagnant California air, thick with the smell of melting tar and jet fuel. Frank did not even bother closing his door. He shot out of the truck like a man half his age, his heavy boots hitting the pavement hard. I stepped out of the driver's side, my dark blazer already sticking to my back. I walked to the rear of the truck and dropped the tailgate. The heavy steel hinge shrieked. "There he is!" Frank bellowed. Caleb was standing near the edge of the lot. He looked sharp, crisp. He wore his navy dress whites, the fabric pristine, the creases sharp enough to draw blood. Frank closed the distance in 3 massive strides and pulled Caleb into a crushing embrace. A real bear hug. The kind of hug a proud father saves for his hero. He slapped Caleb's back so hard the sound echoed across the parking lot. Mary scrambled out of the back seat, her rosary beads shoved deep into her purse, and rushed over to wrap her thin arms around her boy. I stood by the open tailgate. My hands rested on the blistering hot metal. I waited. Just a nod, just a passing glance, something to acknowledge that I had driven them 3 hours through dead-stop traffic, that I existed in the same physical space. Nothing. I was invisible. A ghost haunting my own bloodline. Frank pulled back from Caleb, his face red and beaming. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, then turned his gaze back toward the truck. The smile vanished. The warmth died instantly. His eyes hardened the second they locked onto me. He marched back to the tailgate, shoving past me like I was a piece of rusty yard furniture. He reached deep into the truck bed and grabbed the thick handle of the massive 30-pound Nikon camera bag. With his other hand, he grabbed the cheap plastic handle of the 50-quart Igloo cooler packed to the brim with ice and cheap beer. He spun around and shoved the cooler directly into my chest. My combat reflexes fired. I dropped my center of gravity, catching the plastic handles right before the hard edge crushed my ribs. The dead weight jerked my shoulders down. Before I could stabilize, he threw the heavy canvas strap of the camera bag over my neck. The rough frayed material immediately dug into my collarbone, sliding right over the thick knot of scar tissue from Kandahar. The metal buckles clinked together, a sharp, cheap sound. My hands. The same hands that held a secure comms line to the Secretary of Defense last night. The same hands that signed off on Black Ops budgets. Now they were turning raw and red under the weight of melting ice and family resentment. I adjusted my grip. The ice sloshed violently against the plastic interior. 50, maybe 60 pounds of dead weight pulling my arms out of their sockets. Frank, maybe she could use a hand with that, Caleb said. His voice was low, nervous. Frank scoffed loud and abrasive. He clapped a heavy hand on Caleb's pristine white shoulder. Absolutely not. Your hands are for pulling a trigger, son, not hauling water. Frank shot me a look dripping with pure disgust. Let the secretary do the heavy lifting for once. Lord knows she hasn't done a hard day's work since she quit the program. Caleb looked at me over Frank's shoulder. His eyes met mine. For a split second, I saw it. Guilt. The pathetic, cowardly guilt of a golden child who knows exactly how good he has it. He knew the price being paid in blood right in front of him, and he still chose to stay quiet. Caleb swallowed hard. He broke eye contact and looked down at his polished black shoes. Yeah. Okay, Dad. Caleb mumbled. He turned his back on me. That was it. The final verdict. Frank, Mary, and Caleb linked arms. A perfect American portrait. They started walking toward the main reception hall, laughing loudly about a joke Frank just told. I stood alone by the rusted bumper of the F-150. My knuckles turned white around the cooler handles. The canvas strap ground into my skin like sandpaper. I squared my shoulders. I locked my jaw. I did not drop the cooler. I did not complain. I stepped forward, putting exactly 10 paces between me and the family. 10 steps. The perfect distance to remain unseen. The perfect distance to protect the illusion of their flawless family. The ice rattled and sloshed with every step. The water leaked slightly from the drain plug, dripping onto the hot asphalt and evaporating instantly. The heat baked the dark fabric of my blazer. Sweat stung my eyes, but I kept my spine rigidly straight. Military posture. The physical pain was a welcome distraction. It kept the humiliation from rising up my throat. I focused on the deep burn in my forearms. I used the pain. I let it forge a cold iron wall inside my chest. I was not a sister today. I was not an admiral. I was a pack mule for the Woods family. A beast of burden dragging supplies for a washed-up sergeant and a silent coward. We approached the wide glass doors of the reception center. The air conditioning leaked out onto the hot pavement. A group of high-ranking naval officers stood near the entrance chatting in low voices. Frank pushed the glass door open, strutting through like he owned the entire base. I adjusted the heavy canvas strap, lowered my head, and stepped inside. I was ready to blend into the shadows. But the man standing just inside the doorway turned around, and he looked right at me. The heavy glass doors of the reception center slid open. A blast of refrigerated air hit my face, freezing the sweat on my forehead instantly. The polished terrazzo floor squeaked under my damp shoes. I lugged the 50-quart cooler inside the plastic handles, digging deep trenches into my palms. The camera bag swung against my hip like a wrecking ball. 10 paces ahead, Frank strutted into the lobby like he owned the base. Caleb walked beside him in his crisp dress whites, drawing admiring glances from the civilians. Frank, over here, buddy. A loud grating voice cut through the low hum of the lobby. Bob Miller, Frank's next-door neighbor. He stood near the complimentary coffee station, wearing khaki shorts, a golf shirt stretched tight over a beer belly, and a fake country club tan. The quintessential suburban busybody. The kind of guy who peaked in high school and spent his weekends gossiping over a lawnmower. Frank's chest puffed out. He slapped Caleb on the back and marched over to Bob. I caught up to them, my arms shaking from the dead weight. I set the heavy cooler down on the floor. The ice sloshed hard inside. I stood up straight, rolling the stiffness out of my shoulders, waiting in the periphery. Bob gave Caleb a firm handshake, his eyes wide with exaggerated awe. Look at this guy, a real American hero. Your dad hasn't shut up about you for 6 months. Bob turned his gaze to me. The awe vanished. His lips curled into a tight, patronizing line. And Lexi, you made it. Barely. Frank interrupted. He did not even look at me. He kept his eyes on Bob, his voice booming for anyone nearby to hear. Had to drag her out of her cubicle. She just staples garbage and fetches coffee for the brass these days. A real paper pusher. Bob let out a short, nasal chuckle. He tilted his head, giving me that slow, pitting nod. The look suburbanites give a stray dog that is too ugly to adopt. Well, Bob said, his voice dripping with condescension. Not everyone is cut out for the real work. Takes a certain kind of grit. Right, Frank? Exactly, Frank sneered. She quit when things got tough. But hey, somebody has to operate the copy machine. The insult hung in the cold air. Bob smirked. Caleb looked at the floor tiles. I did not defend myself. I did not correct the record. I looked at Bob. I looked at Frank. I locked my jaw and forced a dead, closed-mouth smile. Let them have their cheap little victory. I tightened my bleeding hands around the plastic handles of the cooler and hoisted it back off the floor. Let's move, Frank ordered, turning his back on me. I want a good seat for the barbecue. I followed. 10 paces behind, always 10 paces. We walked down the wide, brightly lit corridor leading toward the outdoor pavilion. The walls were lined with naval history, photographs of carrier groups, bronze plaques. This was my world. The air in this building belonged to me. But to the men walking in front of me, I was just the hired help. Frank was talking loudly, gesturing wildly with his hands, bragging to Caleb about some bar fight he won 30 years ago. He was completely oblivious to his surroundings. I was not. Coming down the corridor from the opposite direction was a group of 3 naval officers in service khakis. The man in the center was a lieutenant. 2 silver bars gleaming on his collar. He walked with purpose, crisp, professional, confident. They were 50 feet away. The lieutenant's eyes scanned the loud, obnoxious civilian blocking the middle of the hallway. He looked at Frank with mild annoyance. Then his gaze shifted. He looked past Frank's shoulder. He looked at the woman carrying the cooler 10 paces behind. He looked at me, 30 feet away. The lieutenant stopped breathing. I saw the exact microsecond his brain short-circuited. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of old chalk. He knew my face. Just 2 weeks ago, that exact lieutenant was standing rigidly at attention in a classified briefing room at Naval Base San Diego. I was sitting at the head of the long oak table, systematically ripping his tactical insertion plan to shreds with a red pen. He knew exactly who was hauling that cooler. He knew I held 2 stars. He knew I could end his military career with a single encrypted phone call. 20 feet. Panic seized him. The absolute terror of seeing a rear admiral doing manual labor in civilian clothes broke his composure. Military protocol kicked in. Muscle memory took over. His right arm twitched violently. His hand started to snap up toward his brow for a sharp textbook salute. His mouth opened. "Admi!" The word caught in his throat. A bead of cold sweat broke out on his forehead. I did not stop walking. I did not drop the cooler. I kept my posture flawlessly straight. I locked my eyes onto his. Predator to prey. I did not blink. I delivered a microscopic shake of my head. Just a millimeter. A razor-sharp, lethal command projected through thin air. Stand down. Do not blow my cover. 10 feet. The heavy silence of command crushed the space between us. The lieutenant swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. He choked back the greeting. He forced his twitching hand down to his side and quickly averted his eyes to the floor tiles. He practically shoved his 2 companions out of the way, plastering himself against the wall to give me a wide berth. He looked like a man who had just dodged a sniper bullet. Frank watched the officers scurry past. He let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the long corridor. He pointed a thick, calloused finger over his shoulder at me. "See that, Caleb?" Frank practically yelled, his chest swelling with blind arrogance. "Even the real officers will not look at her. They will not even give her the time of day. They can smell a quitter." He puffed his chest out and pushed open the heavy double doors at the end of the hall. Frank had absolutely no idea. He did not know that his daughter just saved him from the ultimate humiliation. He did not know that the officer was not disgusted by me. The officer was terrified of me. I did not smile. I just kept walking. I hauled the ice through the open doors, stepping out into the blinding sunlight and the thick, greasy smoke of the barbecue pits. The thick, greasy smoke of the outdoor barbecue pits hung in the humid air. I followed Frank and Caleb to a weathered wooden picnic table under a massive canvas pavilion. Frank dropped his heavy frame onto the bench, spreading his arms out to claim maximum space. Caleb walked over from the serving line, holding 2 red plastic cafeteria trays. He set the first tray down right in front of Frank. A massive half-rack of ribs rested on the paper plate, the meat glistening with thick, dark molasses sauce. A side of golden fries. A cold draft beer. Caleb placed the second tray in the center of the table. There was only 1 paper plate left. Frank reached over and grabbed the paper plate. He did not look at me. He just slid it across the splintered wood until it hit the edge of the table right in front of my chest. I looked down. It was a single hamburger patty. No bun, no cheese, no sides. Just a solid blackened puck of ground beef that had been left on the grill grate until it turned into pure charcoal. "You sit in the air conditioning all day," Frank said. He ripped a rib apart with his teeth, chewing loudly with his mouth open. Barbecue sauce smeared across his chin. "You do not need ribs. Eat the burger. Leave the real protein for your brother. He actually needs the muscle to hold a rifle." He swallowed hard and took a long pull from his beer. I stared at the black disk of meat. Outside Fallujah, a 19-year-old combat medic with a shrapnel wound in his leg once offered me the very last drop of water from his canteen because I had been on watch for 18 hours. He was a complete stranger. My own flesh and blood threw me a carcinogenic piece of garbage. I did not argue. I did not throw the plate at his face. I picked up the blackened meat with my bare hands. It felt like a piece of pumice stone. I brought it to my mouth and took a bite. The burnt crust shattered against my teeth. The taste of bitter, dry ash flooded the back of my throat. The meat was so hard it scraped against my bottom lip. The dry skin cracked. A sharp, metallic taste leaked onto my tongue. Blood. I chewed the ash. I swallowed it down. I stood up from the picnic table. The wooden bench scraped loudly against the concrete. Frank did not even bother looking up from his ribs. I turned my back on them and walked away. I pushed through the heavy metal door of the public restroom. The sharp, stinging smell of industrial bleach and cheap pink hand soap immediately assaulted my nose. It was a cold, sterile space lined with white subway tiles. I walked over to the row of porcelain sinks and gripped the edges of the counter. I stared at my reflection in the cheap, scratched mirror. A streak of dirt from the heavy cooler marred my white blouse. A drop of blood sat on my cracked lip. The restroom door swung open. The metal hinges whined. A woman stepped inside. She wore a tailored navy blue dress, her silver hair styled with absolute precision. Eleanor Harris, the wife of the Pacific Fleet commander, a woman who sat at my dining table 2 months ago drinking red wine and discussing geopolitical strategies. She walked toward the sinks, pulling a compact from her purse. She glanced up at the mirror. Her hands froze. The compact slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the cold tile floor. Eleanor stared at my reflection. Her eyes widened in pure, unfiltered shock. She took in my wrinkled civilian blazer, the dirt, the bloody lip, and the hollow exhaustion in my posture. If you have ever been cast aside by your own blood, forced to swallow bitter humiliation while no one else watched, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below saying, "I understand." Our silence in those moments is never an act of cowardice. It is the cold, calculated loading of a weapon for a counterattack they will never see coming. "Lexi," Eleanor gasped. Her voice echoed off the tile walls. "Good God, what are you wearing? Why are you out there sitting with that loudmouth civilian?" She took a step closer, her eyes scanning my face for an explanation. She knew my rank. She knew the crushing weight of the authority I carried. Seeing me reduced to this state broke her brain for a second. I did not turn around. I looked at her through the mirror. I raised my right hand and pressed a single finger against my lips. "Stand down, Eleanor," I said. My voice was a low, absolute whisper. "That is a direct order. Do not blow my cover." Eleanor stopped dead in her tracks. The confusion in her eyes slowly melted away, replaced by a deep, heartbreaking understanding. She saw the fresh blood on my lip. She saw the Cold War happening right outside these doors. She gave me a slow, solemn nod. I reached down and turned the heavy chrome faucet. Freezing water blasted into the porcelain bowl. I cupped my hands, brought the water to my face, and washed away the blood and the ash. Above the thick, concrete ceiling, the sky suddenly tore open. A deafening bone-rattling roar ripped through the air as a squadron of FA-18 Super Hornets flew directly over the building. The acoustic shockwave vibrated the water in the sink. The mirror rattled against the wall. It was the sound of my world, the sound of absolute power. I grabbed a brown paper towel and wiped my face clean. I crushed the paper into a tight ball and threw it into the trash can. I turned toward the door. It was time. Boom! The ear-splitting roar of twin F/A-18 Super Hornets ripped through the sky over San Diego Bay. The sonic force hit the ground like a physical shockwave. Thousands of civilians in the outdoor pavilion instantly clamped their hands over their ears, cringing away from the deafening noise. I did not cover my ears. I stood outside the restroom doors, looking up at the gray steel bellies of the fighter jets tearing through the clouds. The bone-rattling vibration coursed through the concrete beneath my shoes and shot straight up my spine. It was the sound of absolute lethal authority. The sound of my real world. The heavy, humiliating weight of the barbecue and the bitter ash in my mouth burned away. The brutal noise pumped cold military discipline back into my blood. I rolled my shoulders back. My posture snapped out of the slouch of a pack mule and into the rigid, perfect alignment of a flag officer. I gripped the heavy canvas strap of the camera bag and walked toward the main auditorium. The massive hall was packed. 2,000 people. Families, officers, and politicians cramming into rows of folding chairs. The air was thick with the smell of cheap cologne floor wax and nervous sweat. Frank was already bulldozing his way down the center aisle. He shoved past a young mother and ignored a man on crutches leading Mary and Caleb straight to the second row. The VIP section, 4 plush red velvet seats reserved with crisp white name tags. Woods family. Frank dropped his massive frame into the aisle seat. Mary sat next to him, clutching her purse. Caleb took the third. I walked up behind them, my shoulders aching under the 30-pound camera bag. I unhooked the rough canvas strap from my neck and moved to take the 4th empty seat on the end. Frank's arm shot out. He grabbed the heavy Nikon bag from my hand and slammed it down hard onto the velvet cushion. The heavy thud echoed over the low murmur of the crowd. I stopped. I stared at the bag sitting in the chair meant for me. "Get to the back of the room," Frank ordered. He did not lower his voice. He wanted the surrounding families to hear him. "You need a wide angle to get a good shot of your brother, and put the bag on the seat. The floor is too dirty for the lenses." A camera bag got a velvet seat. The daughter who drove them 3 hours and hauled their ice got the concrete floor. He looked up at me, a nasty, smug grin twisting his sunburned face. He was testing me, pushing the boundary in public to see if I would break my cover and cause a scene. He wanted me to argue. He wanted an excuse to play the victim, to yell about how I was ruining Caleb's big day. I looked at his muddy Timberland boots resting on the polished floor. I looked at the plush velvet seat. I did not argue. I turned around and walked up the long sloping aisle. I walked past row after row of proud parents and smiling siblings. I kept going until I hit the back wall, the absolute furthest point in the room. I stepped into the shadows near the heavy exit doors. I pressed my back against the cold painted drywall. The chill of the plaster seeped through my thin blazer. I was standing next to 2 men in dark suits with coiled earpieces. United States Secret Service. They gave me a quick, sharp, assessing look, then immediately relaxed their posture. They recognized a predator that belonged in the same jungle. I was completely isolated from my family, banished to the dark edge of the room. But standing against that cold wall, I had the ultimate tactical vantage point. I could see every single face in the auditorium. I could see the back of Frank's thick neck. The house lights suddenly dropped. A harsh spotlight hit the wooden podium on the stage. The crackle of a microphone. Then the heavy, solemn brass notes of the United States Navy Band filled the room. The Star-Spangled Banner. 2,000 people stood up in unison. Down in the second row, Frank puffed his chest out so far the buttons on his polo shirt strained. He threw his hand over his heart and started singing. He sang louder than anyone else in his section. His voice was off-key and aggressive, completely lacking any actual reverence. He was performing, playing the role of the ultimate patriotic American father, a man who sacrificed so much for his country. The sheer hypocrisy of it made my stomach turn. The anthem reached its crescendo. As the final note echoed through the silent, respectful hall, Frank dropped his hand. Before sitting down, he turned his massive head and looked all the way to the back of the room. He found me standing in the shadows. He shot me one final sneering look of pure disgust. The look of a man entirely convinced of his own untouchable superiority. I did not look away. My arms were pinned to my sides. I curled my fingers inward, digging my nails violently into my palms. It took every ounce of sheer willpower I possessed to kill the automatic muscle memory, screaming at my right arm to snap up into a rigid textbook salute. I kept my hands balled into tight fists. I stayed perfectly still in the dark. The trap was fully set. The heavy red curtain behind the podium began to part. The heavy red velvet curtains behind the stage parted with a slow mechanical hum. A single man stepped out from the wings. He did not walk, he marched. The sharp, hard crack of his leather boot heels against the polished hardwood stage echoed through the massive auditorium. The sound was measured, precise, lethal. Lieutenant General Michael Vance, Commander of Naval Special Warfare. A 3-star legend with a chest full of ribbons that read like a history of modern combat. He stepped up to the heavy mahogany podium. He leaned in close to the microphone. Screech! A sharp split-second burst of acoustic feedback pierced the air. 2,000 people went dead silent. You could have heard a single brass casing drop onto the concrete floor. The low murmur of proud families, the shuffling of feet, the clearing of throats, everything vanished instantly. The entire room held its breath, completely paralyzed by the sheer gravity of the man standing under the spotlight. Down in the second row, Frank was practically vibrating with self-importance. He leaned hard to his right, driving his thick, bony elbow right into Mary's ribs. "Look at that, Mary," Frank whispered loudly, his voice scraping like rusty metal in the quiet room. He pointed a stubby finger toward the stage. "That is a real general up there, 3 stars. You see the seats I got us front and center? We are right in his line of sight." Frank puffed his chest out again, straightening his cheap polo shirt. He squared his jaw, tilting his head up toward the stage. He was waiting for it. The acknowledging nod. The respectful glance from one warrior to another. Frank genuinely believed that his presence in that velvet chair mattered to the man who commanded the deadliest operators on the planet. Up on the stage, General Vance did not pull out a speech. He did not look down at the podium. He lifted his chin. His eyes, cold and sharp as a falcon's, began to sweep the auditorium. A slow, deliberate, tactical scan. He swept over the front row of local politicians. He swept over the second row of VIP families. His eyes slid right past Frank's puffed-out chest, like Frank was nothing more than a speck of dust on a radar screen. Frank's eager, expectant grin faltered slightly as the general's gaze moved on, completely ignoring him. Vance's eyes continued to cut through the crowd, row by row, deeper into the hall. Then he stopped. His gaze locked onto the far back corner of the room, the dark, shadowed pocket of space right next to the heavy metal exit doors, where the drywall met the concrete, where the Secret Service agent stood, where I was standing. Even from 200 feet away, I saw the exact moment the general found me. I saw his jaw clench. I saw the muscles in his neck pull tight. He looked at the heavy 30-pound camera bag slung over my injured shoulder. He looked at my wrinkled civilian clothes. He looked at the stark, isolating distance between me and the rest of the families. He knew my rank. He knew my clearance. He knew I was the architect behind the Pacific strategy that kept his men alive. And he saw me standing in the dark like a banished servant. General Vance lowered his hands. He gripped the thick edges of the mahogany podium. He squeezed the wood so hard that the knuckles on both his hands turned a stark bone white under the harsh stage lights. The rage rolling off him was palpable. It was a cold, quiet fury that sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the room. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. It felt like an hour. The tension in the auditorium was a physical weight pressing down on 2,000 chests. Finally, Vance leaned directly into the microphone. "Before we begin," he growled. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a heavy, gravelly authority that shook the floorboards. "I am looking out at this room, and I see a severe violation of military protocol." A ripple of nervous energy shot through the crowd. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Down in the second row, Frank let out a low, mocking scoff. He shifted his weight in his plush velvet chair and smirked. He actually leaned forward, craning his thick neck, looking left and right to see which poor, pathetic fool was about to get chewed out by a 3-star general. He thought it was a show, a piece of entertainment put on just for him. Frank had absolutely no idea. He did not know that the crosshairs were painted squarely on the back of his own balding head. Up on the stage, General Vance let go of the podium. He stood up to his full height. He raised his right arm slowly, deliberately pointing his index finger straight out into the crowd. General Vance stood at the heavy mahogany podium. His right arm was locked straight out, his index finger cutting through the dead air of the auditorium. It was a spear made of bone and absolute authority. He aimed right over the top of Frank's balding head, past the VIP rows, past the local politicians. He aimed directly into the deep, cold shadows hugging the back wall. "I see a severe violation of military protocol," Vance said. His voice was a low, rolling thunder through the speakers. Down in the second row, Frank was grinning. He actually turned in his velvet seat, pulling his cell phone out to record whoever was about to get publicly destroyed by a 3-star legend. Vance did not blink. He locked his eyes onto mine. "We do not leave the architect of our Pacific defense strategy standing in the dark." Vance's voice rose, hitting a hard metallic edge that commanded immediate, unconditional obedience. "It is an absolute honor to have you here. Welcome aboard Rear Admiral Lexi Woods." The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Rear Admiral. Before anyone could process the gravity of that rank, the Master Chief Petty Officer, standing stage left, stepped up. He filled his massive chest with air and unleashed a raw, guttural roar that threatened to blow out the sound system. "Attention on deck. Kaboom!" The sound of 300 highly trained lethal operators moving at the exact same millisecond. 300 Navy SEALs, the most dangerous men on the planet, violently pushed back their chairs. They shot up from their seats. 300 pairs of polished black boots slammed down onto the hardwood floor simultaneously. The concussive impact shook the walls. They spun around, 180 degrees. Every single operator turned their backs to the stage, turned their backs to Frank, and faced the dark corner in the back of the room. 300 right arms snapped up. The fabric of their dress whites ripped through the air with a sharp whoosh. A textbook razor-sharp salute, held completely rigid, dead silent. They were not saluting a coffee-fetching secretary. They were not saluting a quitter. They were paying absolute, unyielding respect to the woman who held their lives in her hands. The woman standing with a cheap 30-pound camera bag digging into her collarbone. I did not flinch. I stepped out of the shadows. I walked away from the cold drywall and stepped into the harsh glare of the aisle lights. The heavy camera bag still hung off my shoulder. My blazer was wrinkled and stained with dirt from the F-150. But my spine was forged steel. I stood perfectly straight, my shoulders squared, my chin parallel to the floor. I did not look at my mother. I did not look at Caleb, who was standing at attention with the rest of his class, his face completely drained of blood. I brought my right hand up. Crisp, brutal. A flawless return salute. I held it for exactly 3 seconds. The military standard. I let the silence burn into the minds of every single civilian in the room. I snapped my hand down to my side. "Thank you, gentlemen." I projected my voice down the long center aisle, cold, sharp, slicing right through the heavy air. "Carry on." Kaboom! 300 boots snapped back. 300 arms dropped. The SEALs retook their seats in perfect synchronized discipline. Down in the second row, Frank was completely paralyzed. He looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. The cheap plastic cell phone slipped from his sweaty fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp clack. He did not reach down to pick it up. He could not move. His thick sunburned neck rotated slowly, painfully, until he was looking back at me. His face was the color of wet ash. His jaw hung open, slack and stupid. The arrogant, puffed-out chest had completely caved in. The man who had spent the last 3 hours humiliating me, bragging to his neighbors, and wiping his muddy boots on my security clearance was currently suffocating under the crushing weight of reality. A quitter, a paper pusher. The lies shattered. Thousands of shards of glass drove themselves right into Frank's fragile, pathetic ego. He was not the tough guy. He was not the warrior in the arena. He was a washed-up, bitter old man who had just forced a United States Rear Admiral to carry his beer cooler in front of the commander of Naval Special Warfare. Sitting right next to Frank, Bob Miller leaned away like Frank had a contagious disease. Bob stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute terror. Then he looked at Frank, his lip curling in disgust. "You arrogant, lying piece of trash!" Bob whispered, his voice a harsh hiss that carried up the aisle. Frank shrank. He physically folded in on himself. He slumped down into the plush velvet chair he had been so proud of. He brought his thick, shaking hands up to cover his face, trying to hide from the burning stares of the VIP families sitting around him. He wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. I stood at the back of the room. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just watched him break. If you have ever waited years to watch the truth finally destroy the lies of a narcissist, hit the like button right now. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below saying, "Karma." Tell me about the moment your abuser finally realized they could no longer control your narrative, because there is absolutely nothing more satisfying than watching a fake empire crumble under the weight of undeniable truth. The ceremony resumed. General Vance gave his speech. Caleb crossed the stage and got his trident pin. Frank did not cheer. He did not stand up. He sat frozen in his seat, staring at the floorboards, utterly humiliated. When the final applause died down, the double doors at the back of the auditorium were thrown open. The crowd began to flood out into the muggy California afternoon. I turned around and walked out first. I did not wait for them. I walked straight across the hot asphalt of the parking lot, heading right back to the rusted, foul-smelling cab of the F-150. I popped the heavy metal door open and slid into the driver's seat. The air inside was stifling. I waited. 5 minutes later, Frank appeared. He was not strutting anymore. He dragged his feet across the pavement, his head down, looking like a beaten dog. He pulled the passenger door open and hauled his heavy frame onto the frayed fabric. He slammed the door shut. The silence inside the truck was violently thick. I put the key in the ignition. I did not start the engine. Frank's thick fingers gripped the edge of the dirty dashboard. His knuckles were white. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with desperate, ugly breaths. The shock was wearing off. The humiliation was calcifying into something else, something desperate. He turned his head slowly. His bloodshot eyes locked onto the side of my face. "You set me up!" Frank hissed, his voice shaking with venom. "You set me up!" Frank's voice was a low, ugly hiss. He gripped the edge of the dirty dashboard. The heavy metal door of the F-150 was sealed shut, turning the sweltering cab into a pressurized vault. The smell of his stale sweat and the lingering odor of his burnt barbecue mixed with pure, unfiltered desperation. He was cornered. His public facade was completely annihilated. But a narcissist does not surrender. They rewrite reality. They play the victim. "You planned this whole thing." Frank spat his teeth, grinding together so hard the sound cut through the silence. "You let me walk in there blind. You let me look like a fool in front of Bob, in front of the general, just so you could flex your rank. You humiliated me." I did not start the engine. I kept my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. "You think wearing some stars on your collar makes you better than me?" Frank leaned toward me. His face was blotchy red with panicked anger. "You never served a day in the dirt. You never sacrificed a damn thing for anyone in this family. You just hid behind a desk and let real men like Caleb do the bleeding." The engine block ticked as it cooled down. The time for tactical breathing was over. The time for maintaining cover was dead. I reached inside the breast pocket of my blazer. I did not pull out my military ID. I pulled out my thin leather wallet. I flipped it open and slid 2 fingers into the hidden back slot. I pulled out a single wallet-sized photograph. It was sealed in thick, heavy plastic. The edges were worn smooth from years of being carried across 3 different continents. I did not hand it to him. I flicked my wrist and threw the laminated photo hard. It hit Frank square in the chest, bouncing off his polo shirt and landing face up on his thick thigh. Frank blinked. He looked down. It was a photograph taken inside a dimly lit forward operating base triage tent. The woman in the photo was lying on a canvas stretcher. Her desert camouflage uniform was completely saturated with dark, glistening blood. Her right shoulder was a mangled, pulpy crater of torn flesh and shattered bone. Her face was pale, covered in black grease and dirt. Her eyes rolled back from the sheer, blinding agony of the morphine wearing off. It was not a picture of a paper pusher. It was a picture of a slaughterhouse. Frank stared at the plastic rectangle. His thick, calloused fingers hovered over it. He did not want to pick it up. He did not want to touch the reality of what he was seeing. But the image was inescapable. Kandahar, November 2010. I said. My voice was a cold, flat monotone, the voice of a prosecutor reading a death warrant. Frank swallowed, a loud dry click in his throat. My convoy was hit by an IED. I continued staring straight through the windshield at the asphalt parking lot. We took heavy incoming fire. I caught 2 rounds from an AK-47. One shattered my collarbone, the other tore through the muscle. I turned my head slowly. I locked my eyes onto his. The bloodshot panic in his face was fully exposed. I took those rounds while dragging a bleeding Marine behind a concrete barrier. I lay on that canvas stretcher for 6 hours waiting for an evac chopper. Frank finally picked up the photo. His hand was shaking. The laminated plastic rattled faintly against his fingernails. He stared at the torn, bloody flesh of the daughter he had just called a coward. "Do you know what day it was, Frank?" I asked softly. He did not answer. He could not speak. It was Thanksgiving Day. The words hung in the suffocating heat of the truck cab. I was lying on a metal table. A field surgeon was digging hot shrapnel out of my shoulder without enough anesthetic, and my satellite phone rang. A nurse held it to my ear. Frank's eyes ripped away from the photograph and stared at me, wide, terrified. The memory of that phone call was suddenly clawing its way back into his brain. "It was you," I said. "You called me." Frank opened his mouth, but only a raspy, broken breath came out. "You did not ask how I was doing. You did not ask if I was safe. You called me to scream. You called me to yell at me for being selfish. You cursed me out for choosing the Navy over coming home to carve a damn turkey. You called me a disappointment while they were picking bullets out of my bones." I reached up and pulled the collar of my white blouse to the side. I exposed the thick, jagged keloid scar that snaked across my collarbone and up the side of my neck. The scar the canvas strap of the camera bag had been grinding against all afternoon. Frank stared at the scar. His eyes traced the violent raised tissue. He looked back down at the blood-soaked stretcher in the photograph. Then he looked at his own dirty, unscarred hands. The delusion snapped. The 30-year fortress of toxic masculinity, of blue-collar superiority, of weaponized incompetence, it all collapsed inward. The sheer, undeniable weight of his own monstrous behavior crushed him. He had spent his entire life trying to shrink me so he could feel tall. He had abused the very person who had bled to protect the freedom he bragged about. Frank's broad shoulders slumped. The air rushed out of his chest in a ragged, pathetic wheeze. He bent forward, burying his face in his hands. Then came the sound. It was not a dignified cry. It was an ugly, guttural sob. The sound of a broken man realizing he was completely, entirely hollow. His thick fingers dug into his scalp as he wept into the steering column. "What did I do?" Frank choked out the words muffled by his hands. "Oh God, what did I do?" I watched him cry. I felt no pity. I felt no anger. The heavy burning weight I had carried since that Thanksgiving in Kandahar simply evaporated. The debt was settled. The ledger was clear. I reached over and snatched the laminated photo from his lap. I slid it back into my wallet. Get out of my truck. The flickering red neon sign of the local Denny's buzzed like an angry hornet. It was 11 o'clock at night. The cracked vinyl booth stuck to the back of my blazer. The diner was dead empty save for a tired waitress wiping down the counter with a bleach rag. Frank sat across from me. He stared down at a thick ceramic mug of cheap watered-down black coffee. The steam curled up and vanished into the cold air conditioning. He looked 15 years older than he had that morning at the base. The aggressive bluster, the puffed-out chest, the cruel smirk, it was all gone. The toxic armor had rusted straight through to the bone. He ran a thick, calloused finger along the chipped rim of the mug. He did not look at my face. I was an E5, Frank said. His voice was a dry, grating rasp like sandpaper on bare wood. A sergeant who peaked at 25. I never promoted. I watched guys younger than me, guys with half my grit put on brass and walk right past me while I stayed stuck in the mud. I did not interrupt. I drank my ice water. I was terrified of you, he whispered to the black coffee. You joined up and you just kept climbing. You got the gold bars, then the oak leaves, then the stars. Every single promotion you got made me feel smaller in my own house. I had to break you down. I had to make you a failure in my own head just so I could still feel like the giant. The confession hung in the air. It was heavy with the smell of old frying grease and burnt coffee beans. A brilliant tactician knows exactly when to press an attack. A master commander knows exactly when to stop shooting. The enemy infrastructure was completely decimated. There was no honor in firing into the rubble. I reached across the sticky laminate table. I placed my hand over his. His knuckles were covered in deep, permanent stains of engine oil and age spots. He flinched at the sudden contact, fully expecting another strike. I just held his scarred hand down against the table. I have enough officers shouting orders at me, Frank, I said. My voice was steady, entirely stripped of its military edge. I do not need another superior. I just needed a father. Frank squeezed his eyes shut. A single heavy tear leaked out from his wrinkled eyelid, cutting a clean track down his dirty, sunburned cheek. It was a pathetic, ugly, necessary tear. Between us sat a cheap oval plate of lukewarm French fries. Frank picked one up with shaking fingers. He broke the grease-soaked potato in half. He slid the smaller piece across the scratched table toward me. A silent, desperate olive branch. I picked up the greasy fry. I put it in my mouth. It tasted like old cooking oil and the sharp, stinging salt of his tears. I chewed it slowly. The bitter, ashen taste of the burnt hamburger from this afternoon was finally gone. We sat in the low hum of the diner refrigerators, chewing on a delayed, painful forgiveness. The glaring morning sun beat down on the concrete drop-off lane at San Diego International Airport. The heavy exhaust from idling shuttle buses and the smell of raw jet fuel filled the air. Frank pulled my heavy luggage out of the trunk of his car. He did not let me touch the bags. He hauled the heavy nylon suitcases onto the curb himself, his breathing heavy but deliberate. He turned around to face me. He was wearing a brand new navy blue cotton t-shirt. The bright white block letters stretched across his broad chest read, "Proud Navy Dad of a Rear Admiral." The cardboard price tag was still sticking out of the back collar. He stood awkwardly on the concrete curb. He wiped his palms on his denim jeans. He took a deliberate step backward, creating a crisp physical distance between us. Frank squared his heavy shoulders. He brought his right foot back, slamming his heavy boot heel into the concrete. The sharp crack echoed over the noisy airport traffic. He brought his right hand up to his brow. A rigid, flawless textbook military salute. "Goodbye, Admiral," Frank said. His voice was thick, completely devoid of sarcasm. It held a new, unbreakable gravity. Absolute respect. I straightened my spine. I snapped my right hand up, returning the honor. The boundary was permanently set. The hierarchy was undeniable, written in the very air between us. "Safe travels, Sergeant," I replied. I dropped my salute, turned my back, and walked through the sliding glass doors of the terminal. I did not look over my shoulder. 5 minutes later, I stepped out the opposite side of the terminal and slid into the back of a waiting, armored black Suburban sent by the Department of Defense. The heavy bulletproof door slammed shut, sealing me inside a vault of absolute silence. The leather seats squeaked as I leaned back. Deep inside my blazer pocket, my secure encrypted satellite phone vibrated violently against my ribs. I pulled out the heavy black device. The screen flashed red. A priority override from the Pentagon. I pressed the cold receiver to my ear. "Admiral Woods," I answered. The steel returned to my spine instantly. The personal war was over. The real war was waiting. True power is never about shouting the loudest in a crowded room to prove you exist. True power is enduring the absolute worst they can throw at you, holding your ground and letting the undeniable truth speak through your blood, your rank, and your honor. Forgiving them is how you free yourself from the poison. But justice must always be served cold and in plain sight. If you agree that the truth always outranks a lie, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. And if you are out there fighting in the dark, doing the grueling, invisible work of healing from the deep wounds your own family gave you, leave a comment down below with the word peace. You are not a casualty. You are a commander.